My name is Anne. I'm a voluntary guide here, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial.
Okay,
certainly a much loved institution in the ACT, if not, of course, in Australia. The War Memorial is the brainchild of Charles Bean, who was an official First World War correspondent, and he travelled with Australian troops to Gallipoli in Turkey and then on to Belgium and France. And here he witnessed the death of thousands of young Australians. And he determined, while being overseas, that there should be a place back in Australia where we can honour their sacrifice and to remember them. And also for a place for family and friends to come and remember their loved ones. So on the 11th of November, Remembrance Day, or Armistice Day as it was called after the First World War, the Australian War Memorial was opened, 1941. Ironically, the building that came out of the First World War, but then built and opened during the Second World War, when Australia, of course, was involved in the World War and soon to become under threat from the enemy. The purpose, I suppose, in showing you around is the purpose indeed of the Australian War Memorial, and that is to commemorate the sacrifice of Australians who have died in conflict and those on operational service, but also to thank Australians, thousands of Australians who have served our nation in times of war. Sure. Pretty much out there. Welcome to the commemorative area, the very heart and centre of the Australian War Memorial. We can see behind me is the pool of reflection. It's meant to be a quiet area of reflection and contemplation. The eternal flame that burns there in the memory of the over 103,000 Australians who've lost their life in the service of Australia. Above the pool, you can see the Hall of Memory, and we'll go there very shortly. And it's mounted on top of it is the iconic dome that is there, and that forms the logo of the Australian War Memorial. Each day at 4:30, in the spot where we are, there's the last post ceremony is held, and a serving member of the Defence Forces talks about the service and life of one of those 103,000 Australians who died. Often there are families and relatives and friends who come from, who are related to the veteran. Wreaths are laid on the side of the pool of reflection, and at the ceremony's conclusion, a lone bugler stands just outside of the Hall of Memory up there and plays the last piece. It's free to come. It's just an amazing service, isn't it? The sandstone walls with the names of areas, theatres of conflict where Australians have served, beginning behind us at the Sudan, even before Australia was independent in 1885, and goes down to the First World War areas of conflict, followed on the eastern side the Second World War conflicts, and post-45, Korea, Vietnam, and then finally in the south here we have recent conflicts named there. Hopefully there'll be no more names. Well, these are the cloisters, yes. Western and the eastern side, yes. And they hold the Roll of Honour. And we're going to go up to the First World War to begin our look at the Roll of Honour. arranged in units. So we have 23rd Battalion, 22nd Battalion. Everyone who served in those battalions and who was killed or died during the war is listed in alphabetical order. Because as Charles Feen, the person, of course, the visionary who created this institution, said everybody is equal in war. There's no rank, there's no place where they came from, there's no mention of honours or awards won. So everybody is equal in this roll of honour. This first person I'm going to talk about is Jay Martin, who's about 6 down from the top there. And James Martin was a young lad from a large family, 6 children. He was the only, he had 5 sisters, the only son in the family. He grew up along the Murray River, which is in between the border, the people who are from out in the UK, the border between New South Wales and Victoria. His father at the time joined the army, and he refused, steadfastly refused for quite some time. No, you can't join. But when he threatened to, on his way from Egypt to Gallipoli, on the way, his boat was attacked and sunk. And James spent several hours in the sea. But he was rescued and then sent straight on into the trenches when he arrived at Gallipoli. The trenches were not a very healthy place to live. Lack of fresh water, lack of fresh food. And because James had already suffered the effects of being in seawater, salt water, for quite a few hours, his health suffered. And he actually lost a lot of weight. So they decided to evacuate him to a hospital ship off the coast of Gallipoli. Within 2 hours of his arrival, he died of a heart attack. He's buried at sea. His name is on the Lone Pine Cemetery at Gallipoli. But being our youngest ancestor, James Martin was 14 years and 9 months old when he died.
Wow.
Oh my God. I always think how amazing it is that he got past all the enlistment procedures. But that's what it was. Another veteran, another First World War story, it's just down here. So we're just going to have a look at this name here, a member of the Australian Medical Corps, Kirkpatrick JS. Every year, and it's approaching very quickly, thousands of Australian school children learn about Simpson and his donkey at Gallipoli. James Simpson Kirkpatrick is that person. He was British, but migrated to Australia and joined up when the war began. And he was a stretcher bearer. He landed in the first wave at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915, and he is well known for his saving, helping injured soldiers. And he and his trusty little mule, donkey, Duffy, carried many soldiers from the trenches and down to the safety of the beach where they could receive medical attention. But of course, as he was winding his way down the hills onto the beach at Gallipoli, he was under intense sniper fire. By May the 17th, he was shot by a sniper, and indeed he died. But he was well known by the Anzacs, who were already on Gallipoli, and was seen as a hero. He was mentioned in military dispatches after his death and awarded this posthumous honour, but before that, of course, he was the hero of the Anzacs who were on Gallipoli. His statue of he and Duffy carrying an injured soldier is down. You might have seen it if you came in the bottom. The main entrance is down in that main entrance. There's a little courtyard off that there. Well, James Martin, Kirkpatrick, Simpson, Johnson, remembered in the Hall of Memory. We'll come in here.
Have you been to?
No. The Hall of Memory, the very essence, certainly an important part of the commemorative area. The 15, what we can see here, features in the hall, 15 stained glass windows, west, east and north. And they show veterans of the First World War. Because after all, this was designed to commemorate the First World War. At the bottom of each stained glass window there's a word. There are 15 quintessential qualities of Anzac soldiers and nurses from the First World War. But of course, this was being constructed when Australia was again at war in the Second World War. So the designer, the artist, Napier Waller, added a recognition of those Second World War service people. So we have nurses, we have sailors, we have the army, and we have the Air Force. With reference to the drawing. On top of the coffin were placed a bayonet and a sprig of wattle, but also a small container of soil was poured over the coffin by a First World War I veteran, Robert Combe, and he was heard to say, "You're home now, mate." He is unknown. We don't know whereabouts in Australia he came from. We don't know what his rank was, if he received any awards. But the one certain thing that we do know is that we have walked past his name as we have come down that Roll of Honour from First World War. In his dedication speech, the Prime Minister said he is all of them and he is one of us, to reflect that. And those words are on the foot of the coffin there. We'll see on top of the tomb there are red poppies of remembrance. And the custom of placing red poppies next to people's names as a symbol of remembrance began on that day in 1993. And of course now we see the wall is smothered in them. I think that's part of that reflection. But it's a pretty impressive installation. But we start here. This is the Second World War names from the first in the Roll of Honour. It goes about 3/4 of the way down, then followed by Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, peacekeeping operations. This HMAS Australia is where I'm starting today. I'm going to talk about the captain, Captain Emile Deschanel, just here. And he was a career sailor. He joined the Navy, not the Army, when he was 14 in 1916. And he did a lot of training. He obviously had a long service because I'm going to talk about 1944 here. And he trained in Australia, but also went overseas and trained in England. And when war broke out, he was serving in the British Navy. And he helped with the evacuation of troops from Dunkirk, and then remained in that area and were on ships patrolling the North Sea and trying to protect shipping from German U-boats attack. But in 1943 he returned to Australia, and his distinguished service was honoured with a promotion to captain. And then in October 1944 he was captain in, it's a hard word to say at the moment, HMAS Australia. And they were involved, part of a combined American-Australian force at trying to recapture the Philippines from the Japanese, under the command of MacArthur. The HMAS Australia is said to be the first ship to be attacked by kamikaze or suicide bombers, aircraft. And I'm assuming that a lot of you have heard of kamikaze aircraft and pilots, but of course their aim was to dive straight into ships and onto their decks and cause as much damage as they could. And Australia came under attack by 5 kamikaze aircraft suicide bombers. The HMS Australia there were fires on deck, and just as one of the Japanese aircraft was sort of rolling off the side, its petrol tank exploded. And of course, already fires on there, you can imagine the effect of that petrol adding fuel to the fire, as it were. It impacted on the bridge and the control tower. Emile Deschano, along with many of his commanders and operational staff, were badly injured, and the captain only lived for a few hours after the attack. He was buried at sea alongside his fellow seamen. But he was remembered in a number of ways. The United States honoured him with the Order of Legion of Merit. But in Australia, his brilliant service, his distinguished service, was honoured in 2003 when a Collins-class submarine was launched, and it is the HMS Deschano. One of the few, I think, that are still actually operational. Morning. How are you going? Beth Cuthbertson was on the Vinabrook and it was sunk. Survivors made it onto shore to the nearby Banker Island, which is occupied by the Japanese. Banker Island is just north of Sumatra. It was occupied by the Japanese. The Japanese captured the survivors. They took the men into the jungle and shot them or bayoneted them, and returned to the beach where 21 nurses were. 22 nurses, sorry. And they were ordered to face the sea, marched into the sea until they were about waist height, and then gunned down. 21 of those 22 nurses were killed. Beth was one that was killed. This is February 1942. Her family were told that she was missing in action. And it wasn't until August 1945, so well over 3 years later, that the family learned of this massacre, now known as the Banker Island Massacre. But determined, and of course the story told by the surviving nurse. For 3 generations, there have been numerous children in the Cuthbertson family named Elizabeth, Mary or Beth. They, every 5 years, they sponsor a nursing scholarship in Victoria in her honour. But around the lake in Bendigo, where she lived and worked, there is a bench, and on the bench there's a plaque the family put there in honour of Sister Mary Beth Cuthbertson, one of the 21 nurses massacred by the Japanese on Banker Island on the 16th of February 1942. Lest we forget any of the names that we see, of course, here on the roll. We find ourselves in the First World War Gallery, 1914 to 1918. And when Imperial Germany invaded neutral Belgium and then went further into France, Britain declared war on Germany. And as such, Australia was automatically at war. It was in our constitution, and that did not change until 1943. And so Australians greeted the war with enthusiasm, remembering that thousands of Australians called Britain the mother country. They had, of course, long established relationship with them. And thousands of Australians flocked to join the newly created Australian Imperial Force. But this one display here tells the story of the first naval victory. And it was really important that the Indian Ocean to the west of Australia was kept safe and open from German shipping or attack, because troops and supplies were being sent from the west, going up through the Suez Canal and then onto Europe. So that sea lane had to be kept safe. But between August and November of 1914, a German cruiser, the Emden, thank you, had been raiding various British strongholds in the Indian Ocean and had actually sunk about 23 ships. But early in November 1914, the HMAS Sydney came across the Emden, raiding a British radio station on the Cocos or Keely Islands, which are northwest of Western Australia. The Sydney had an advantage over the Emden because it was a more well-equipped ship and it was faster. There was exchange between the Sydney and the Emden, and we can see here reflected in the ship's bells the Victor and the Vanquished. The Emden was run aground by its captain on the reef, the Cocos Islands, and surrendered to Australians. And this was indeed a celebration for Australian Armed Forces, because this is the first victory of the Royal Australian Navy. And people around Australia, of course, celebrated this because it really proved that Australia could stand up against its enemies, being untested in war before this time. But by the end of 1914, at least 50,000 Australians had come forth and volunteered to form the AIF. And they were going to be sent to Europe to fight against the Germans. But while en route from Western Australia, their course changed. They were sent to Egypt, and then they were sent to Turkey, Gallipoli. That's right. On the 25th of April 1915, a combined Australian and New Zealand force, now known as the ANZACs, Australian New Zealand Army Corps, landed on the beach at Gallipoli. Now, they were in Gallipoli because, and they were part of a larger British-French force, but they were in Gallipoli in Turkey because the Ottoman Empire had joined the war on the side of the Germans. So they were sent here to fight the Ottomans. And over the 8-month period, they spent at Gallipoli, in the trenches and on the hills of Gallipoli, the Anzac legend was born. Our Australians were recognised for their fighting qualities, those qualities that were reflected up in the stained glass windows in the Australian War Memorial, Hall of Memory. One of those battles was Lone Pine, and this dioramas that are very popular throughout the museum, and of course heritage items themselves, built during the 1920s. And this diorama does show the battle at Lone Pine. So on the 6th of August 1915, Australian troops attacked the Ottoman trenches at Lone Pine. And we can see it was at 5:30 in the afternoon, and they had a little bit of advantage as the sun was setting and the sun rays were shining into the enemy's eyes. But we can see here that they were ready for close combat. They have rifles are mounted with bayonets, and they're also wearing white armbands. And those white armbands were there so that they could determine friend or foe once they got into the dark trenches. And you can see here, even though there's a light on here lighting up what's inside the trench in this diorama, of course it would have been very, very dark, and a way of course identifying who was on your side and who wasn't. But in a lot of cases, the Australians had to dig through the top of the trenches, heavily fortified with pine logs and covered with earth. And we can see in the centre here some of the soldiers chopping through the hole in the top of the trenches. Australians took control of the first trench and also some open communication trenches. And for the next three days, the Ottomans counter-attacked. And 3 days of very heavy fighting. Australians lost 2,300 casualties. Casualties referring to deaths, wounds, captured by the enemy or just missing in that 3-day period. Ottoman casualties, 6,000. To reflect the fierceness of the battle that was held in these 3 days, there are a number of awards of Victoria Crosses. Now, Victoria Crosses are the highest award that can be given to an Australian in the face of the enemy. Over the 8-month period of Gallipoli, there were 9 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians. In this 3-day battle, 7 of those 9 were awarded. All of those 7 Victoria Crosses are on display in the Hall of Valour that I'll point out to you later. One of those Victoria Cross recipients was Lance Corporal Keesall, and he was known as the master bomb thrower. And he would pick up bombs that were thrown by the Ottoman into their trenches and just throw them back. But his number one skill was capturing them mid-air and throwing them back.
Oh gosh.
Now, despite being wounded twice, he kept up that effort for 50 hours. And of course, his story is in the Hall of Valour. By December 1915, the campaign was a failure and all troops were withdrawn. Some Australian troops, the Light Horse, were sent to the Sinai Desert to fight the Ottoman again. But the majority of Australian soldiers were sent to the Western Front, to the countries of Belgium and France.
They're about 2 kilometres away. You can see where that is.
Okay, that's all right. Replica of one of the stained glass windows, so one of the nurse in the Hall of Memory. You've noticed when you come into these galleries, 1916, 1917 galleries, that the lighting is very dim and it reflects the sombre mood and events of those years. Thousands upon thousands of young soldiers were killed during this time. 1917, the greatest loss of life. But Australians were fighting in northern France, around in the Somme River. Some of you might have heard of the Somme area in France. And one of the nurses that was caring for the Australian wounded was Sister Rachel Pratt, and it's her story of devotion. So she had joined very early on in the war and had actually nursed it on the island of Lemnos, had nursed casualties from Gallipoli. But by July 1917, found herself in northern France caring at the Australian clearing station for Australian casualties. One night in July, the hospital was attacked at night and bombs exploded and ripped through as she was caring for her patients, ripped through the canvas tents. And she received shrapnel into her shoulder, into her lung and into her back. And you can imagine the sort of pain she must have been in. However, she calmly continued to nurse her patients, keep them calm, but eventually the loss of blood and pain meant she collapsed, and she was actually evacuated from that area to recuperate in England. However, she returned later, once well enough to do so, come back to nursing in France, and did so until the end of the war. However, her bravery and devotion whilst under fire gained her the military medal, and that's the one on the far left of those medals there. She was one of 8 nurses in Australia to receive that military medal, and the other medals are her service medals. But Rachel did return to France, continued nursing, and then she continued her story of devotion after the war. She returned to Melbourne and she established a halfway house for soldiers returning from the war and cared for them for many, many years, despite the fact that her health suffered greatly because not all the shrapnel was able to be removed from her body. But she certainly is reflective of that devotion stained glass window that we see in the Hall of Memory.
No,
board it carries 6 people.
Got a big package, you can put a lot in it. You just take it.
I'm going to have a look at this painting here. So this painting is by Will Longstaff, an official artist during the First World War. Once we've come into the 1918 gallery, of course the lighting has lifted. And it's the 4th and final year of the war, although people, of course, did not know that it was the final year of the war. But a number of victories by the Allies against the Germans pushed them back to their main defensive line, which was the Hindenburg Line. And this painting talks about the battle on the 29th of September 1918, when it breaks the Hindenburg Line. And it was their main defensive structure that felt like it was like a security blanket. It protected Germany from the rest of the world, as it were. It ran down the border between France and Germany and was several kilometres wide, covered with fields of barbed wire, concrete pillboxes manned with machine guns, tunnels and trenches. But the Allies during September had gradually been pushing the Germans back towards the Hindenburg Line. And when taking a stance this 29th of September, Australians and Americans, combined force, had joined together with the Americans that only recently come into the war, and they attacked the Hindenburg Line and over 4 days broke through. And it was a combined attack, not just for the personnel, but also the weapons that were used. You see aircraft painted in attacking and giving reconnaissance, no doubt, from the air. You see the plane over there. We can see the smoke from artillery fire. And we can see that deadly weapon that was developed during the First World War, the tank, the use of the tank. And this great big looming steel machines coming over the top and over trenches that would, of course, been very terrifying for those fighting against them. We can see the debris of battle. We can see the soldiers searching tunnels and trenches. And in the middle, we can see the very despondent German soldiers who were captured. And indeed, this battle, breaking the Hindenburg Line, was a really major event because the Germans felt that would, like Singapore, could never be captured. And the population of Germany, weary of 4 years of war, rebelled, and there were rebellions broke out across the country. The Kaiser, or the king, fled the country never to return. And weeks later, the government faltered. And on the 11th of November, an armistice was signed. Now called Armistice Day, but of course now we know it as Remembrance Day. Over 6 million people have been killed, and destruction, mainly in Europe, on a scale that had never been seen before. And this is why people said, this must be the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, 21 years later, the world was embroiled in a Second World War. Large items, airplanes, submarines.
That's amazing.
It is. Amazing. You can come every year.
Come every year.
You see something completely different. We're going to go off and have a look at this. So we're just going to have a look at this model here of the HMAS Sydney. But this is a model of the HMAS Sydney. And this is not the HMAS Sydney that I talked about in the First World War. This is the second HMAS Sydney. And the HMAS Sydney of 1941 was the star of the Australian Navy. And it was like a superstar, They had excellent service in the Mediterranean, but had returned during 1941 to protect the west coast of Australia. And on November the 19th, it approached what they thought was a Dutch merchant ship. But in fact, it was a disguised German raider, the Cormorant. And the Sydney asked for recognition signal from this merchant ship, which of course there were, certain codes that could be exchanged through ships to identify if you're a foe or friend, The Sydney kept coming forward and forward, closer and closer to the Cormoran. And when it was almost parallel alongside, the German captain ordered the ensign to be unfurled, the German ensign, and the guns to be uncovered, and fired almost point blank range. The Sydney returned its fire as well. But within 5 minutes, both ships were mortally wounded, disabled, or certainly suffering a great deal of damage. When the control tower was knocked out by the first German rally, and the reconnaissance plane here, full of petrol of course, was hit by one of those shells and it exploded, and you can imagine the damage that was spread on the Sydney. The Cormoran's engine had been damaged through torpedoes, and they had stopped working. The ship was just still in the, washed in the sea. The German captain ordered abandoned ship and explosions to be set. And about 300 German sailors got off the Cormoran and were in their life rafts, and of course can tell the story of the HMAS Sydney. But the HMAS Sydney steamed south, and these German sailors could see it well into the night, to at least midnight, and they could see the ship burning. And then it just disappeared out of sight. Search parties were, the Germans were recovered. Search parties looked for the HMAS Sydney, but nothing was found. About 10 days later, this life raft here, the Carly float, was recovered. There's no markings to say that it's part of the HMAS Sydney, but they assumed it was. But they could not locate the Sydney. 645 souls were lost, and the country mourned. This was, as I say, the star, the flagship of the Australian Navy. It wasn't until 2008 that her wreckage was actually found off the coast of Western Australia, and not very far away was the wreckage of the Cormoran as well. At Geraldton in Western Australia, there's a monument to this battle indeed. But of course, not many people know its location because it is a war grave and is respected as such. This was November the 19th, 1941. On the 7th of December 1941, a dramatic turn took place in terms of the war. Imperial Japan attacked the US naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and that meant an incredible turning point for the war and for Australians indeed. I'll just show you this map. November 1942 was indeed a turning point, certainly for Australia. Australians were fighting a new enemy. Australians were fighting in different areas of the world. And the war, as we can sort of see implicated in this map, the war was coming to Australian shores, and indeed it did. The Japanese captured Singapore. 4 days later, Darwin was bombed. And Northern Australia, Broome and over into Queensland were bombed on a regular basis by the Japanese for at least 18 months. We can see that they've come into Timor and into New Guinea. And on May the 31st, 3 midget Japanese submarines entered Sydney Harbour. And one was sailed out of the heads, one was captured in the nets, and one let off a torpedo. It was aimed at a US naval ship, but it hit a converted Manly ferry, which was accommodation for Australian troops, killing about 27 people.
I'll send you.
People, once they reached, the Japanese reaching the heart of Australia, the largest city in Australia, certainly thought, this is panic stations. Can you imagine it? But Australians took other measures to protect themselves against air raids by the Japanese. And just 1942, as I say, Australians were worried. And to protect themselves against possible Japanese air raids, people built air shelters in their backyard, and this one here is called Anderson shelter. These were designed, it came from Britain, but they were prefabricated and made in Australia. They were expensive, so not everybody could afford one for their backyard, and so people made air raid shelters from whatever materials they could, cobble together. But they had bench seats on either side, had candles and lanterns to keep the light, depending on, of course, if it was needed during the time of the air raid attack. There's water, there's blankets, supplies that would help you last through a sustained attack. Now these shelters were in backyards of homes, but they're also in public places like parks and schools, near theatres, near the city centres, and they will remain there, those structures there, well after the war. By the end of 1942 there were 32 airports, but in the favour of the Allies. Major naval victories against the Japanese at Coral Sea and Midway was pushing back the advance into the southern Pacific. Australian soldiers had stopped and pushed back Japanese over the oceanic ranges in New Guinea. And New Guinea, again, very close to Australians. If you want to come back and learn about the Dakota Trail and track, there's a lovely audio-visual show, just Australians spread all over the world. And we'll go and have a look at some stories associated with that. Just on purpose to mention this gas mask here that was meant for a child. I could never, my sons would not stand for putting that back as a child. Well, that's a normal gas mask. That one was meant for So, above us we can see the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War. It's a Spitfire and a Rada aircraft. Well known for their speed and manoeuvrability. Australians flew these Spitfires in the Battle of Britain, in the air wars over Europe. But Spitfires were also brought to Australia in the defence of Darwin. Louis Truscott was a member of the 1939 Melbourne Premiership team. And then in 1940 he joined the Air Force and went to Canada and trained in the Empire training, aircraft training scheme. And he flew this Spitfire over Europe. He came back to Australia and trained other Australian pilots. Unfortunately, he was lost in a training accident off the coast of Western Australia. But he is remembered to this day because the most valuable player in the Melbourne Football Club of each season is awarded the Truscott Award. So Bluey Truscott, but this particular plane he flew. Yeah. The 25-pounder gun underneath were used in North Africa. They were British aid, but they were used extensively in throughout the war, different theatres of the Second World War. But this one is North Africa, and you can see how it's painted to sort of have that desert sort of camouflage. So 25-pound shells, I think that's about 11 kilos, but run by a crew of about 5 to 7 soldiers, and a very effective crew could fire about 5 of these 25-pounders off in a minute. But they were really effectively used, and they were manoeuvrable, so you could set up in one location but then move them fairly easily and quickly to a new location. The war in New Guinea was, of course, really on the minds of most Australians due to its proximity. See above us here, this is the final campaign's gallery. 1944 to 45. At no other stage in the war had so many Australians been committed to the armed forces. And they were having success pushing back the Germans from the west and from the east, Russia from the east, and of course the other allies from the west. And also the Japanese Navy in particular were being forced north back towards Japan. But in a last-ditch effort, perhaps we could say that the Germans developed these unmanned rockets, one of which we see above is called the V1 rocket. And they were unmanned bombs. They carried about a 90-kilo payload, and they had gyroscopes, compasses on them, and they could set a course up to 240 kilometres. And they were really difficult to defend against because nobody knew when the timer went off that was inside, the engine cut out and then just plunged to the earth. And so there was no prediction about where it was going to fall to earth or what it was going to attack. And London suffered a great deal of attack by the V1 rockets, as well as Antwerp, a port in Belgium. About 10,000 of these rockets were launched between June 1944 to March 1945. And as they crossed the English Channel, pilots constantly tried to shoot them down. They were very fast and they were difficult. At one stage in early 1945, a young Australian pilot called Ken Collier, whose picture we see here, he found himself in this position. He'd been trying to shoot down one of these rockets, had exhausted his ammunition, and he said, I'm determined to get this thing out of the air. And what he did was fly his aircraft up behind it, and with his wing tip, he tipped one of the wings of the bomb, and it sent it off course, and it plunged into the countryside with basically, little damage. Well, he returned to his base, and he told him the story. You can imagine how happy he would have been. And he said, told them the story, and the staff there went, yeah, right, mate, just keep telling us that thing. But they went and checked his aircraft, and they saw the damage on his wing. Paint was missing, and of course they had to believe him after that. And other pilots emulated his quick thinking and ingenuity, and hopefully saving hundreds of lives from the impact of these bombs. Unfortunately, Ken was killed very late in the war, May 1945, while on a mission over Germany. But his quick thinking certainly saved the lives of many. Germany surrendered. It wasn't until August 1945 that the Japanese surrendered. And we can see, of course, the headline here. It happened in early August, but the 15th of August was designated public holiday by the Australian Prime Minister Ben Chifley. And people took to the streets, as these video clips show us. The small ship here, the Japanese are signing the peace in Tokyo Harbour on the USS Missouri. The USS Missouri is on display there, and you can see there's a plaque on the deck that says this is where the peace was signed. But in these celebrations across Australia, there was one young lady who wore this jumper here, and we can see her picture just in there. And on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, this was published in a Melbourne newspaper and said, do you know these people? Well, the girl in the middle, the lady in the middle, was Lois Martin, and her husband said, yes, I know, that's Lois, and her two friends who worked at the Kodak factory. They had joined and worked in a factory as part of the war effort during the war. And Lois had made this jumper for this very day, had made things. Unfortunately, she passed away by this time, but she wore it on that one day, VP Day, Victory in the Pacific Day, and then packed it away and kept it for the rest of her life. And of course her husband kept it and then has donated it to the War Memorial following that discovery of through the picture. But the 6 years of war ended in that 15th of August 1945, and Australians celebrated. Throughout the world, 60 million perished in undeniable destruction across many, many countries throughout Europe and Asia. Nothing in comparison to the First World War. And for Australia, it brought a lot of sweeping change after the war. The role of women had certainly changed during the war. Manufacturing industries had started in Australia, and thousands of refugees fleeing war-torn Europe came to Australia and added to our population and added to our skill base, of course. So post-45 was a very bright and prosperous time for Australia. But of course, never to forget, through our honouring those people who had sacrificed during the Second World War. That brings us to the end of the tour.